is open, and God knows what's going on with that. But this thing of the President of the United States invoking these authorities to do things through executive action rather than going through the legislative process is a potential problem. Okay, this could seriously lead to authoritarian rule here in the United States. We got to be very careful with these things because these are dangerous little baby steps to a place that we don't want to go in this society. This is not what the founders envisioned. I'm sure there are cases where executive power is necessary and we should give the president enough leeway to do that. But beyond those few and rare circumstances, you should not be willy-nilly about trying to legislate in the executive branch of government. It's very dangerous to allow that to happen.
Yeah, there's one thing when you said, okay, there's a policy we need to create because there's a bureaucratic problem. We need to create an executive order to solve this bureaucratic problem. But this isn't a bureaucratic problem. This is a policy, and this is a legislative policy, and that's the difference. There's a difference between a bureaucratic policy and a legislative policy, and this is a legislative policy, not a bureaucratic one.
And it's worse than what you're saying, though, James, because this was explicitly rejected by the legislative branch of government. So it's worse than just saying that, well, it's just, a legislative policy, blah, 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 whatever it is, however you characterize it. I'm not criticizing your statements here, but this was explicitly rejected.
Yeah, it's rejected, and you can't get public buy-in. One of the reasons we have the legislative process, and one of the reasons it's so slow, is so you can get buy-in from the public. So you can actually explain to the public can respond, and that takes time.
Yes.
And so that's why the legislative process, and when you have activists running governments, they don't want to take the time. They just want to do what they feel is right, regardless of the consequences.
Yes.
And the reality is the only social contract we have is the Constitution. And if they're not willing to follow it, then they're not willing to follow it. That should be a sign to the rest of us.
Yeah, exactly.
And so we're going to move on for a minute. It's the same kind of topic. The Democratic governor in Massachusetts, I believe, is banning the ability for her state to buy single-use plastic water bottles.
Yes.
Now, as a generic day-to-day use, okay, fine, right? How many water bottles is the DMV buying, right? It's okay. But, for disaster relief, for first responders, for disaster relief, you actually need these one-time use water bottles. Those things are actually life-saving.
Yes.
And, and there's conditions where you need portable. What are you going to do? Send them in glass bottles, aluminum cans? I mean, there's a reason we use plastic bottles because it helps with, water's relatively heavy. And if you can save weight in the container, it makes it cheaper to ship and easier to ship.
I really believe that all this talk about climate change, the so-called climate change crisis that is supposed to be ongoing, is making intelligent people dumb, is making them crazy, because this is all done in the name of climate change. A lot of things these days are being done in the name of climate change. A lot of it is without any kind of scientific backing. And these people are going headlong and they're telling us, oh, we have to do this in the name of climate change. This particular policy in Massachusetts about these single-use water bottles is insane. It really is. I mean, you plastic bottles have been in use for I don't know how many years here in the United States, and is one of the most efficient ways of holding water and transporting water. And yet she thinks she's brighter than the market. This is what these government officials think, especially these progressive ones. They always think they're brighter than the market and they could come up with something more efficient and something that works better. But the only thing they end up doing is spreading misery. This is not going to go well. Eventually, it's going to backfire. Like some of these policies, these climate change policies, are already beginning to backfire. This one is going to, without a doubt, because plastic is one of the most efficient ways to store and to transport water. And these crazy people is gonna meet up with the realities of this sooner or later.
Yeah, and this is one of those things where I think the governor would have the right to issue a policy that says, hey, departments in Massachusetts, you have to be very careful about when you buy single-use plastics, right? Only buy them if you absolutely need them. You're restricting it. It's fine. But she's banning it.
She's banning it, yes.
She's banning the use of them, and it's all for virtue signaling. Because you can just issue a policy, say, hey, avoid buying plastic bottles except when you absolutely have to, right? That's a policy that you can actually implement, and I wouldn't have a problem with it. But these virtue signaling bans, And the problem is, as we accept it, as
Yes.
more and more we accept it, they're going to do it more and more. And we've already seen it in the last 3 years, how they've used public health emergencies as rationales to limit your constitutional rights, to restrict your constitutional rights. And we're gonna see more and more of that as we're allowed. And as Richard is pointing out, in New Mexico, the governor tried to use public health emergency as an excuse to limit the Second Amendment in her state. And so Richard's got a few things to say about that.
An 11-year-old boy was killed allegedly in a road rage incident in Albuquerque, New Mexico. That death was seized upon by the governor of New Mexico, Michelle Lujan Grisham, to decree a 30-day ban on concealed and open gun carry rights in Bernalillo County, where Albuquerque is located. Any violent death is tragic. However, as a pretext for a ban on constitutional rights, it is not justified, particularly when it will, by the governor's own admission, not work. Criminals will not obey the ban. The sheriff of Bernalillo County has publicly refused to enforce the ban due to it being unconstitutional. U.S. District Court Judge David Urias, a Biden appointee, has blocked the ban. Multiple gun groups are suing to overthrow the ban. Governor Lujan Grisham knew most of this would happen before she issued the ban. Clearly, she is attempting to appeal to the fears of those afraid of guns on an emotional level. The larger issue, though, is that she has boldly and explicitly asserted that constitutional rights are not absolute, and that she, under her ability to declare a public emergency, has the authority to cancel them at her whim. The most obvious precedent for this sort of thinking are the numerous public health emergency decrees issued to deal with COVID at federal, state, and local levels. Mandatory masks in public, mandatory vaccinations if you want to keep your job, mandatory social distancing in public, mandatory lockdowns of businesses and schools, all of them constitutionally questionable. Is not being prevented from doing business a violation of the Fifth Amendment property rights? Are not social distancing and lockdown orders violations of First Amendment rights of association? In New Mexico, bans on carrying guns are blatant violations of Second Amendment rights. The governor obviously does not think the Constitution means what it says, but instead means what 4 or 5 Supreme Court justices can be persuaded to say it says. Hopefully, the courts and law enforcement officers on the ground will continue to enforce what the Constitution actually says. I'm Richard Fields with reports from the fields.
When governors start talking about how constitutional rights aren't absolute, when you have, like here, the mayor of Sacramento a few years ago, he was talking about, our citizens don't walk around with constitutions in their pocket. These are people telling you something that they actually don't care about your fundamental rights.
Exactly.
And this is just such a growing problem. And it's not just a growing problem from the progressives. It's when you get anybody, the farther you go, either left or right, the less they care about your rights, then the more they care, and they care more about theirs.
Yes.
They care about their versions of the rights and not yours. And that's a big problem, especially when we're talking about the slow or maybe not so slow road to authoritarianism, right?
Yes. I mean, the thing is here, in these 3 cases that we are looking at here, first Biden and the job core, the climate core proposal that he has, he wants to do that through an executive order. He has no constitutional authority to do it. Then we had the governor of Massachusetts want to ban single-use bottles. Well, she may have some constitutional authority to do that, so I don't question her authority to do that, but the policy is quite idiotic. But it's a use of executive power. And then we have the governor of New Mexico, which is using executive power in a clear violation of our Second Amendment rights. Okay, and she's saying that, oh, the rights is not absolute, and she has the authority to suspend those rights when she thinks it's necessary in the name of some health emergency. I guess it was crime is becoming rampant. And the idiotic thing about the case in New Mexico is that the only people these things are going to affect are the law-abiding citizens.
Yeah.
That's the only people going to be affected by this, because no criminal is going to say, oh my God, you know, the governor, she just said through executive authority, we have to stop shooting people. And I'm going to stop today just because of that. Which criminal is going to say that?
Yeah, they're already breaking tens of laws.
Yeah.
Like the next one's going to matter.
Yes. But the point is, though, is that these people think they have this executive authority to do these sort of things. This is the thinking of authoritarianism, and this is a real problem.
Yeah,
and we got to be careful about these things, about these people using executive orders to achieve what they cannot achieve through the legislative process. And this is potentially problematic.
Yeah, it's the authoritarianism mindset that
Exactly.
is actually that is, you know, they like to point it out when they see it in other people, but they never seem to look to point in the mirror.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
that is the first place you should really start, is in the mirror.
And here's again, we were talking about it. Democrats have come up and they've made there was an article in Politico about how Democrats are admitting they've lost their advantage on education, and they're trying to figure out why. It's like, have y'all looked in the mirror? Have you asked yourselves, what have we done? What have we done to where we used to have this really huge advantage on education issues, right? Democrats used to have a huge advantage on education issues, and in the last 5-6 years, it's evaporated.
Sure,
it's completely evaporated. And rather than going, hey, you know, maybe politicizing education wasn't such a great idea.
Exactly. Yes. You see the big problem here. The Democrats, the left, whatever, they have gotten in bed with the teachers' unions, and no matter what reform is proposed to the current situation, it doesn't matter what reform it is. The teachers' union are opposed to it. The teachers' unions own the Democratic Party, and they are not going to ever do any reform unless they are forced to, unless parents stand up and revolt against this madness. We have a situation here where inner city kids in particular, I mean the education system, the public education is a complete mess. It's a national disgrace. But inner city kids, black and brown kids, are suffering in this education system, and still the teachers' unions will not relent. They want more pay, they want more this, they want more benefits, they want more this and more that. And nothing changes. Just recently, they did a survey, I believe it was in Baltimore, of the high schools, and they could not find one kid. I'm talking about they could not find one kid who was doing math or reading at grade level. In Baltimore, where they're spending gobs of money per student, theoretically, because a lot of it is probably being soaked up by the bureaucracies. And nobody cares about this. We are handing these little kids diplomas that functionally they cannot even read. And they're telling us they're educating our children. This is what zip code tyranny does to us. That where we are tied to our school, depending on where we live. When we should have a policy, and we are seeing some of that coming about now, where we should have policies where money should be following children. So if a kid wants to go to school in his neighborhood, he can do so. He or she can do so. If he or she wants to go outside the neighborhood, that's fine. They should be able to do that too. Let the money follow the child. But the teachers' unions will never relent on this, because that is a loss of power. That's a loss of power to them. And the Democratic Party is in bed with these people. And these are the biggest amount of people who tell us how much they care about black and brown kids who are suffering in that education system in the inner cities of America. This is a disgusting thing, and it's a national disgrace.
Yeah, and I've always said activists don't know how to run things. Mass market, activists can run a niche organization, but they can't run something that has to do a mass market.
Indeed.
And the problem is we have far too many activists in unions, in the education bureaucracy, and in politics now, and everything is breaking.
Yeah.
And we've got a couple more stories that are tied to this, right? And we're going to kind of tie these two together. There's an article that came out that more young people are struggling. They're struggling with mental health. They're struggling with all kinds of issues. And there's a teacher who says that this year, the kids are 100% different.
Yes.
Yeah, the kids are changing, and their kids are struggling. And, if we look back in the last 3, 5, 6, 10 years, it shouldn't actually be all that surprising.
Right.
It's not just that we've politicized education. That's bad enough. But we've done it with this hypocrisy. We're telling kids that we need to be inclusive, except for those people.
Yes.
We're telling kids we want diversity, except diversity has to be we all have to think the same way.
Exactly.
Right? We all can look different. We can all dress different. We can all
Yeah.
it's great, but we all have to think the same way.
Exactly.
And and we wonder and we blame things like social media rather than taking the one constant throughout these things, and that's the education system.
Yes.
Every single child goes through the education. Not every child uses social media the same,
Yes.
but every single child has to go through an education system. And when we have politicized that, and not only just politicized it, we tell parents that they need to get involved. We need to get involved, but when they get involved, they stick the FBI on them.
There we go.
And I just read an article just last night that the FBI never rescinded that letter.
Well, as a matter of fact, Merrick Garland was before the Attorney General of the U.S. was before Congress, the House of Representatives, the Judiciary Committee, and they were asking him about that very letter, about have he rescinded it. He did not answer that yes, I have rescinded it. He didn't. He said there's nothing to rescind. So that letter, as far as we know, is still out there and is still in force, where they're going after parents because these are the new threats to what I don't know, but they are the new threats.
Yeah, well, they are new threats to the authoritarianism that is growing in the country. And who's the biggest threat? Parents. Because parents will do anything for their children.
As they should. I would. I try to, I'm not going to pat myself in the back to say I'm a good father, but I have tried my best and try to do as many things I can for my kids. And I think all parents would want to do that. But the problem we have nowadays and is this authoritarian move where we have to all think alike, and this thing is really affecting our kids, okay? Because one of the biggest things that happened in the last 5 years, the last 6 years or so, is these COVID lockdowns, and kids were cut off from their peers, and it was a disaster beyond a disaster. I remember there was a video online of a parent came home one day. As far as I can tell, it's a true story. And she told her daughter, her little daughter, she looked like she was about 8 or 9 years old, and told the daughter, you know what's going to happen? You're going to go back to school. And the little girl just broke down and cried. I was so touched by that. She cried because, out of joy of going back to school. She's going to see her friends. All her friends she can play with again. But there we have the government went out there with the help of the teachers' unions, and they closed down the schools. These kids were isolated. They didn't have the interaction that they need for their own development. And now we're seeing some of the results, the depression, the anxiety of all these little kids.
Yeah, and it's not just the closing of the schools. We have, for the last 10 years, made our children literally afraid of everything.
Yes.
We're even making them afraid of parents. Here in California, right, we're seeing them where they say, oh, well, they're calling under the name of transgender, we're going to let the schools now make parental decisions for you so to protect from the parents. But as we know, as someone who has raised 5 teenagers have irrational fears.
Oh, yes.
If I tell my dad he's going to kill me. No, I'm not.
You may feel so, but no.
And I've experienced this with a child who wanted to talk to me, who had a fear of talking to me about their growing sexuality.
Yes.
And there's no rational. You run through the family's all accepting, everybody's there's Nobody cares.
Yeah.
But yet they were afraid to have the conversation because
Right.
teenagers have this irrational fear of what's going to happen. They get all these things in their head. The hormones spin and they don't have enough experience to say, no, it's not actually going to happen. You know, everything for a teenager is so big, right? It's so big and so now.
No, yes.
And when we make them afraid of literally everything, it's literally, you cannot walk down. You're supposed to be afraid of social media. You're supposed to be afraid of, you know, of the food you eat. Everything. Afraid of the climate. All we had to worry about when we grew up was being afraid of a nuclear bomb being dropped on our head.
But you know, James, so they do raise there an important point, in the sense that kids are now feeling a lot more pressure than they did in previous times. And while we had growing up, we had our own pressures, but kids are now having, I think, more pressure upon them, placed upon them. And one of the big things that is happening, unfortunately, and this is really unfortunate, the government is trying to get between parents and children. And that could not end in any way good. I mean, we have this thing, you just raised this issue about the transgender issue here, where in a custody battle between two parents, the government is now saying a parent could lose custody of the child if the parent does not affirm the child's new gender identity. Now think about the insanity of that. I mean, this is a child who some may think he or she is Superman, he or she might be a dog or some kind of stuff and things like that. Children have all sorts of imagination. I've raised two boys and I can talk from personal experience. They have all sorts of things in their head. So a little child, 4 or 5 or 6 years old, come to you and say, well, it's a little boy. And little Johnny says, well, you know, I'm a girl. And the parents having a problem and they're about to go to court on the matter. And if one of the parents disagree, that child, that under California law as it is right now, that parent who disagrees with the child could lose custody of their child. They have to be taken into consideration in the courts now. This is madness.
Yeah. And
this cannot end well, because what you're doing there, this policy, if this goes into effect, what you're doing there, you're cutting off that child from that parent.
Deliberately cutting off and we know how well that goes, right? We know how well that goes if you cut off, you know, children need two parents.
They do. They do.
Because, you know, parents, everybody balances everything, right? You know, whether it's the Force, if you're Star Trek, whether it's yin and yang, if you're, you know, everything is balanced. The world needs balance. Of, you know, what is it? Nature absorbs a vacuum. And so what happens when you take away one parent? You have a vacuum. And we're going to have government deciding that, oh, on this because of a political issue.
Yes.
It's a political issue. It's not that the judge sat down here and said, you know, we're going to weigh all the issues, and this parent, for whatever reason, is slightly better than this one, so they're going to get 55% of the time. This one gets 45%, right? That's kind of the stuff that but no, we're saying this single issue is going to be so important that you're going to. We've lost our.
It's insane, and you know, you talk about the pressures on children, okay, and you raise that issue, but these are the sort of things that are adding to the kids' pressures, which is resulting in the anxiety and the depression that we are seeing now. I mean, this is horrible, and you know, and I think COVID was a pressure, that the isolation that came from the COVID lockdowns is all adding up. It's all putting those pressure on those kids, and where they are now, as the teacher said, totally different. Of course, they're different.
Yeah, I think COVID was the straw that broke the camel's back, so
yes,
to speak.
Yes.
Well, in this particular case, it was the bale of hay that broke the camel's back. But we've got less than a minute. We got about a minute or so. We're going to go real fast. Chicago's teachers union boss ends up sending their kid to a private school.
Yes,
imagine that.
Imagine that.
The teachers union boss, no, those public schools aren't good enough for my kid. Right? Or I'm going to go advocate for the public schools, but they're not good enough for my kid.
Yeah. And you know what is absurd? What's so absurd about this particular woman? I believe her name is Stacey Davis or some kind of stuff like that. Well, when she was caught and they asked her about it, she said, "Oh, my son had to go to the school so he could live out his dreams." Okay. As a parent, you know, I would accept that too.
Yeah.
But what about the dreams of all those other kids who you're condemning to the public schools, and some crappy public schools too? I mean, Chicago has some of the worst public schools in the country, and she don't mind other people's kids going there, but her son have to go live his dreams, elsewhere. This is hypocrisy at the highest level.
Yeah, and sound is telling me we're out of time, Leon. Thank you for into that rant. Thank you all for watching. Thank everybody inside there. We've got Kelly, Bridget, Gail, and Daniel for working so hard in the control room tonight. And please remember to love everybody. Good night.
Yes, indeed.